Hi, everyone, and welcome to the 8th episode of Dose of Derm, a dermatology guide for medical students. My name is Emma Holjak.
And my name is Iryna Savinova, and on today's episode, we will be interviewing Dr. Rachel Asiniwasis, a dermatologist and clinician researcher based in Western Canada, her hometown of Regina, Saskatchewan. She is the founder of Origins Dermatology Centre, a combined multidisciplinary model that serves both the general population and provides outreach clinics, in-person and virtual care for underserviced, remote and rural Indigenous, First Nations and Metis communities.
Dr. Asiniwasis is of Plains Cree and Saulteaux and English background. She carries a Master's of Science in Health Sciences in Clinical and Translational Research and has special interest in common inflammatory dermatoses, atopic dermatitis, and psoriasis, virtual care, underserviced areas, holistic impact of skin disease, medical education, and translational interpretation and implementation of research with the ultimate goal of tangible health outcomes. She currently has active educational and research projects ongoing in the areas of inflammatory skin disease, virtual care, and Indigenous and rural health in Western Canada. Without further ado, we are excited to introduce to you today Dr. Rachel Asiniwasis.
Thank you, and I'm very honored to be here. So thanks for having me today, and hello from Regina.
Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to meet with us. I think you're the most distant guest we've had today, the furthest away from here. But that makes it even more special. So we really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you so much.
So we're ready to jump right into our questions. The first classic one we'd love to hear about, of course, is whether you could tell us a little bit about your journey to dermatology.
Sure. So I've just started actually entering my 10th year of practice since I graduated residency. It's hard to believe, to be honest, but what I will tell you is I was a late bloomer in discovering dermatology. And in fact, I never grew up thinking, oh, I'm going to be a dermatologist. I want to be a dermatologist. I actually was quite in the, didn't know much about it at all. And I think a lot of that was because I'm originally from southern Saskatchewan, which is a critically low underserviced area with regards to specialists. And in fact, in an area we have a catchment in the rural and urban area in Regina, we have a catchment area of about 600,000 people. And when I was young, we had about 2 dermatologists when I was a medical student. So I didn't really have much exposure to it at all. Whereas you might see in some larger urban centers, there might be more potential exposure. So it was really kind of under my radar. And it wasn't into the end of my second year of medical school that I had an opportunity to meet my cornerstone mentor, Dr. Peter Hall, who recently won the well-deserved Lifetime Achievement Award at the Canadian Dermatology Association conference in Toronto this year. And he was my very first exposure to dermatology. And in our second year of medical school at the time, we did what's called systems, where we go through, cardiovascular for a month, gastro, breast, neuro, MSK, like all of these topics, right? Peds, gynae, you can keep going all you want. And the very last system we had was dermatology. And I remember thinking, oh, what am I going to do? Am I going to specialize? Am I going to be a generalist? And I started to pick up, I almost called it together, like putting together pieces of a puzzle where I liked little bits and pieces here and there. Like I really like multi-system disease, looking at the whole patient. So I started, internal medicine. I really enjoyed rheumatology, looking at that multi-organ component and immune-based. I enjoyed working with all ages. I learned a little bit about pathology in my second year. I'm like, wow, we can really learn about the little details under the microscope. And then all of these things, minor procedures, nothing too major. I didn't want to be a surgeon in a hospital. And all of these things came together at the very end of my system zero, where I found out all of a sudden it was like hitting me like a stack of bricks that dermatology was a little bit of everything that I liked. And I was like, wow, this is really cool. And I'll be totally honest, I'm really embarrassing myself here, but when before I found out what dermatology was, I thought when I was like a teenager and when I was in my undergrad before medical school, I thought a dermatologist was a scientist. Because you know how you go down the rows at Shoppers and you see, approved by dermatologists or formulated and so forth. And I honestly thought, without putting much thought to it, that it was a science-based, laboratory-based specialty that kind of made these skin products. So that was my misconception. But being exposed to Dr. Hull in the system, and he's a very well-known medical dermatologist and researchers, it just became very clear to me that the skin is a manifestation of both internal and external health. And this is something I always emphasize, where We can really tell a lot about someone's health by looking at their skin. And we don't need a whole lot of fancy tools to necessarily do that. You need your brain, your eyes, and your hands and your knowledge. So I kind of learned that going through the system, external findings of internal manifestations, infections, going through all of the areas we have in dermatology provided a really holistic picture. And then there were disparities, right? Like we didn't know much about Indigenous peoples in health. Dr. Hall did some outreach at that time. So it got me curious. And so I picked up, being the course evaluator, we had a student who evaluated the course with the rest of the students in the class. I picked up an elective, and he actually encouraged me and said that I had a natural skill and gift at dermatology. So I pursued electives, and I was fortunate to get them. And the one thing else that really helped hammer in my interest was I had the privilege of being able to go to Mozambique for a project called Making the Links in Saskatchewan, which is a multi-tiered projects where they send students to northern Saskatchewan to work on reserve, for example, and work with some of the communities and look at health issues and work with the youth. We take some classes, and I even took some Portuguese classes. And I went to Mozambique actually in my summer at the end of the second year of medical school. And we're in a rural area, and what I can tell you is it was really underserviced there too. And there wasn't a lot of fancy equipment that we had at our fingertips, like blood work, x-rays, fancy tests at bedside. We didn't have those in Mozambique. But what I learned through observing the doctor there is a lot of the diagnoses, again, they had to rely on good clinical skills, knowledge, and the skin would often reveal next steps and differentials based on their internal health. Okay, so that was kind of like sealing the deal for me. And then I went through some electives and I just fell in love with dermatology. So again, late. And I was very fortunate to be able to apply across Canada and get accepted at the University of Toronto. And I call myself the girl from the boonies, but I moved there to start my residency, and here I am now. So thank you. Yeah.
That's such a saturated journey. It was very interesting to listen to. And I think that you're so right in saying that really skin presentations come across in every specialty, which is why I think we were so surprised to learn that dermatology is such a small, if at all, a portion of the curriculum in medical school, because it seems like this very specialized niche, but really it's not that specialized at all because it presents across practically every specialty. You see the skin everywhere. So,
and that's a very good point, Iryna, too. And that might lead into some conversations about curriculum and how can we improve that. So I completely agree with you. Yeah. It's the biggest organ, right? So we're going to see a lot of stuff, and it's common primary care presenting concern as well. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for telling us a little bit about your journey to dermatology. The question I wanted to ask is if you could just speak to us a little bit about your practice specifically, what that's like, and also we wanted to highlight and hear about the process involved in creating the only Indigenous dermatology clinic in Canada and how that came about for you.
Thank you. So when I was growing up, my dad's side of the family is very large. And, when I was growing up, being exposed to a lot of family members and a lot of, events that we attended, I would go to powwows, I'd bounce around in a jingle dress. I didn't know what I was doing, but I had fun. But growing up, I actually thought, because Saskatchewan and in Midwestern Canada and Western Canada, we have a relatively large proportion of Indigenous peoples out west. So growing up in Saskatchewan, where there's a lot of Indigenous peoples, I had it in my head that everybody was Indigenous. And then I went to Toronto, where, it's not a common population to see. And I've said this before, but I remember, I think in my whole 5 years of residency, I can count maybe on one hand how many Indigenous patients I remember seeing. And so that to me was an interesting experience. And so, growing up, it just was what I was used to. Toronto, I noticed very different profile. And when I came back home to work, obviously I was in a completely different demographic. And with a lot of Indigenous patients. And as someone who trained in a very heavily urbanized area that's very well serviced in an excellent program, I will say, some of the challenges I wasn't necessarily aware of when I came out to a critically underserviced area that's heavily ruralized and a lot of Indigenous people. So it's almost like an opposite demographic in many ways. I am urban based, but we have a lot of rural patients and a lot of Indigenous patients. So with regards to my practice, I actually see everybody. It doesn't matter their background, their age. We see everybody from all walks of life, all skin problems. And in larger centers, you might be able to specialize in areas if there's many derms, but here we have to kind of do a little bit of everything. My focus, my practice is medical derm, but I do things like patch testings, I do skin cancers, I do excisions, all sorts of things, you name it, I do it, it's in our scope, and it's because we have to have an extended scope. But with regard to the Indigenous part, it's something that just kind of happened naturally in the sense that I didn't come here and open up an Indigenous clinic. The patients came and all of a sudden they knew my dad, they knew this person. I picked up a clinic where my dad was born just across the lake at Fort Capel, All Nations Healing Hospital, so my family's from around that area. And it services the general population, but is actually owned by, some Indigenous tribal councils in the area and has a large reserve catchment area. So being familiar with that area, I started doing a monthly clinic there, and I ended up with a lot of Indigenous patients. And then I reached out to one of my mentors, Dr. Veronica McKinney, he's an Indigenous physician based in Saskatchewan and the head of Northern Medical Services. And she's like, hey, Rachel, do you want to do a clinic up north? It's fly-in. And I'm like, okay. So in 2015, I had my first fly-up clinic to Stony Rapids at the border of the Northwest Territories, which services primarily a Dene population. And that's when I started to see these things that I see in textbooks and describing barriers really come to life over many years that I didn't experience in the urban, well-designed urban area. So in all truth, I didn't necessarily come out of the gate saying I want to do an Indigenous specialized dermatology clinic. It just happened. And then these communities, there's a lot of mistrust in some of the communities, and that goes back for many reasons. For example, the last residential school only closed in 1996 in southern Saskatchewan in Gordon's community, which was the community that I also service. And there is some mistrust based on, histories of institutionalization or personal experiences that they've had in the medical system. There's not a lot of Indigenous physicians. So over the years, I've kind of developed some trust, and how a trust also gets around is word gets around in the community. They're not big communities. And word gets around. So it's like, oh yeah, I saw this person, she cleared my eczema, here's her information. And then the next thing you know, I had this big Indigenous practice. So it just kind of happened. And I feel like it's natural in a way. We often have artists drop by our clinic who are from reserve, and we collect Indigenous art in the clinic. We've been engaged with an Indigenous resource assistant or remote care coordinator as Métis background. And I think it just kind of naturally came together in that sense. And so now, almost 10 years into practice since residency, it's just kind of come into a combined model where we work with different people on our site, and including an Indigenous pharmacist who we've linked with. And we provide all sorts of services to the community. We can see them in an urban setting. I often will go to the communities, or we can do virtual care, which I'd like to touch on as well if we get a chance.
I think that you touched on this duality that I kind of wanted to talk about a little bit more, because I think that it starts an interesting conversation. So I feel like I often think about kind of these two ideas and how they work together. One of them being that we need more Indigenous doctors and Indigenous specialists, yes, because it has been this kind of historical mistrust within the community, as you said. So inevitably, having more Indigenous doctors who can serve the community and often build better trust the community and understand the whole realm of what Indigenous health is very necessary. But then I also feel like, I think as non-Indigenous people, we kind of feel like, okay, well, we're not equipped to serve this community, this population. So that will be someone else's task. So like not ours. So I feel like we kind of place this burden on the few Indigenous doctors that now exist, or I think, are you the only Indigenous dermatologist maybe? So this whole experience put on these limited resources to serve the whole country. So how do we go about support it? So not placing the burden on Indigenous doctors to serve the entire community, and to, as non-Indigenous people, also service our own Indigenous communities within our own province, even if we're not Indigenous. Do you have any advice? Because I know this duality.
Yes, and thank you for sharing that very important question. I think that that's an important question to address. I think that that's going to require a multi-pronged approach. And I think that we have to look at it across the board. And I am going to use dermatology as my scope here, as my specialty, to kind of frame the answer to that question. But the first thing is, medical schools and those in healthcare should definitely be familiar with the historical background and context of the social and legal experiences that have been common to many First Nations and Indigenous peoples in Canada. And you have to understand that historical context in order to really understand why things are, now. So, and there are many examples of that, one being, residential schools, and another is, Indigenous peoples were actually not allowed to vote until the 1950s without losing their Indigenous status. So that was really only to my dad's generation ago. And I met with an elder in Alberta about 6 months ago, and he was describing in his generation and his father's generation the past system, which is a restrictive system relying on a government agent that controlled economic and personal freedom of Indigenous people in terms of leaving the reserve and selling and buying things such as farming produce to be independent. So a lot of these things were not 400 or 500 years ago. You know what I mean? These are real things that happened recently, and the intergenerational trauma is real. So I think that that's one. The other is, I think that other specialties are ahead with this in things like diabetic control and family practice, but in dermatology, I noticed that there wasn't a lot of discussion throughout many years and attending conferences on things like, skin of color and new conversations. And I noticed in the North American context, there often was a lack of discussion on Native Americans or Indigenous people in North America in these. So, we need to have more representation of not just Indigenous physicians and dermatologists, but we also need to encourage all of us, right? Even non-Indigenous people to kind of understand that and support as a whole, because at the end of the day, there just isn't enough of us, right? And then there are other things to think about, like research participation, right? So if there's not there's an article that I just recently submitted, which shows, for example, in atopic dermatitis, which is the most common chronic inflammatory skin disease, critically low numbers of Indigenous people being represented worldwide in North America in trials. So just if they're not represented, they're not necessarily there, right? So we don't want them to become the invisible peoples of dermatology, if that makes sense, especially in North America. They've already been through enough. So we need to shed light on that. So how I think general approaches other than that would be, I think our residency programs need to expand discussions around rural care and, culturally sensitive and competent care, improving initiatives in skin of color, like we talked about a paucity of skin of color in textbook representations. We should include some Indigenous skin disease. We should encourage and mentor Indigenous students and residents and physicians to come together and work on their own novel projects and, even bridge to research with communities using Indigenous research methodologies, such as, there's something called the 4 R's of Indigenous research, which is like respect, reciprocity, relevance. There's many of them. And then the OCAP principles, which is ownership, control, access, and possession. So empowering the communities in their engagement. And I think too, just general educational initiatives such as the Indigenous Skin Summit, which is coming up on November 25th, and that invitation will be circled shortly. So what I'm getting at is there's a lot of groundwork to be laid. Some common diseases, right? We've just found such little information on these communities. And I think that needs to be included in conversations surrounding equity, diversity, and inclusion. So I think it has to be a concerted effort.
I really appreciate you speaking to that. I know there's a big emphasis on not placing the burden on the marginalized populations to have to advocate and teach about the issues that affect them, and for every individual to kind of do that learning themselves. But I appreciate you taking the time to come on our podcast and provide some of that educational information for our listeners as well.
Yeah, thank you. And that just off the top of my head, I mean, if I sat down and thought about this, I could give you 10 more answers or 20, but those are just some initial thoughts. Yeah.
That's wonderful. And I think you're speaking at, is it the Skin of Color conference?
I am, yes, in Toronto. Yeah, this coming October. And we have our actual Indigenous Skin Summit, which is related to the Skin Spectrum conferences. It'll be virtual, so stay posted for that invitation. I'm going to make my own invitation on a video for that and put it on our Instagram. And you can also add us at Origins Dermatology. We're still getting started with our social media, but
thank you for sharing that. So those are a few ways that you can kind of brush up on some additional knowledge if listeners are interested. And I know that we were just circulated information that medical students can attend the Skin of Color Summit virtually for free, which is a really big privilege. So definitely something to take advantage of. Okay.
Absolutely, yes.
We'll jump into our next question.
Yeah, sure.
You can take us away.
Yeah, so something I wanted to circle back to that we spoke about a little bit previously is that you mentioned you have an interest in virtual healthcare. So I was
Yes.
wondering if you could speak a little bit more about how you incorporate virtual care into your clinic and some of the benefits of that.
Awesome. So being in Saskatchewan, heavily ruralized population. So it's not just Indigenous communities that tend to be rural, it's also our rural population in general. And so because we've got a large catchment area, so Canada is actually the second largest landmass, only behind Russia in the world. So if we look at studies that are done in places like Belgium or these smaller countries, the travel is not necessarily, these studies aren't always as reflective of the Canadian context or the North American context. Look at these big pieces of land. So I see a lot of my patients that often have to drive or sometimes take a plane if they're really far north to see an urban-based specialist. That can be costly. So to give you an example, think about, gas, travel time, taking time off work, maybe childcare, meals, right? All of these costs can add up both directly and indirectly. So the question becomes, how can we improve virtual care to these populations in this large landmass, given there are so few dermatologists and there's a high need? So can we say from a cost quality access benefit? And I do have an article if you want me to send that I did write on this. But to give you an example, I was looking at NHB, which is non-insured health benefits, which is a federal covered program for Scottish Indigenous clients, which covers things like fundamental prescriptions or medical transportation. We're seeing over $500 million a year being spent on medical transportation for these northern and remote Indigenous communities. So the question becomes, how can we maybe look at this a little better to deliver care that can be effective and safe, again, from that cost quality access balance? So before COVID, I feel like, and again, this is just my personal opinion, virtual care was kind of just like sparsely talked about here and there. And then the pandemic happened and there were a lot of changes in that sense. So I think now is the active time to kind of start those conversations. So I think we need to have research on it. It's like, for example, if we're how are patients taking photos? How are they accessing virtual care? There are different types of virtual care. There is synchronous and asynchronous. So for synchronous care, that would be real time. So example, using platforms where you're speaking to the person like I'm speaking to you. But there's often a fundamental connection issue in many of these rural and remote communities where they don't necessarily have the bandwidth or the infrastructure to be able to sustain that. So that is where our site has had, it uses a lot of what we call asynchronous care, which is store and forward, for example, where we have a photo and a history, or I speak to the patient on the phone, I have a set of photos and we manage it that way. But there are barriers being identified to that, photo quality being one of them. So I think that these are something that we need to launch Canadian research and initiatives in, and there already are some people kind of starting those discussions. But that's one. And then the other thing too is we have to look at what are the potential benefits from the evidence base, right? Do regional studies, but we also have to look at what are the barriers as well, right? Because if there's inequitable access to certain types of virtual care, right? How do we address those? And this is where kind of novel studies need to come in. Yeah. And the other thing I will mention is virtual care can't replace everything, right? So often we'll have to do a biopsy or dermoscopy or like palpate a lesion or do a bedside test. And like these things you can't do virtually. So there are limitations. But so for example, I find that for people who have inflammatory skin disease like psoriasis, I think there's a real big opportunity there. But if someone sent me a fuzzy picture of an atypical lesion, I would say we need to look at this or this needs to be biopsied. So again, all of these things need to be looked at. And I have an article, if anybody is interested, that discusses this further in Canadian Dermatology Today that was recently published on virtual care in remote and rural Indigenous communities that touch on many of these points and also discuss the evidence base.
That was great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Something else I was kind of thinking about too is I'm sure that in some of these more like distant or rural communities, there's certain points of the year where even traveling to the clinic could be impossible just because of like weather and things like that with roads. So,
and Emma, that's an important point because, a lot of rural and remote communities, again, whether they're Indigenous or not, there are layers of barriers that are faced. Road conditions, some roads are seasonal, some might only be fly-in, transportation, cost. And then there are other barriers too, like we might not be able to access swabs if someone might have MRSA, they don't have the infrastructure to do swabs. there are so many barriers there that have to be included that can confound the outcomes. Absolutely.
I was also curious. So you mentioned that when you moved provinces, you didn't intend to create an Indigenous dermatology clinic, but the
No.
patients kind of came and you were there to serve them. So I was wondering whether, or if at all, or how you incorporated any traditional kind of Indigenous medicine within your
Yeah.
practice of dermatology, and if you
Yeah.
use or advise some of your patients to use some of those traditional herbs and plants
Yeah. So
for
that's
the.
an excellent question. So, for me, coming from, an Indigenous background on my dad's side and having a big family, to me, some of this is like normal. It's like a new area. So it just, I guess maybe the clinic, some patients feel comfortable having us, or they know some of my dad's family. But when it comes down to traditional medicine, it's not when people think about, and some people don't like to use the word Western medicine, but Western medicine insinuates kind of a Western European basis to the medical system in terms of philosophy, values, and approaches towards patients. Some people criticize it to be very, very physical, symptom-based, find it and fix it, siloed approach. But, but medicine is changing, right? And especially with the rise in chronic disease and complexity that we're seeing, for example, with like holistic care. So in my culture, which is Plains Cree, there's the medicine wheel. And have you heard of the medicine wheel? Yeah. So there are many actually different applications and explanations for it. But basically, it looks at a balance of the whole person beyond the physical to mental, emotional, even spiritual for many patients. And spirituality can have different definitions, but to me, it's being able to feel healthy and empowered within yourself and your community to make positive differences as well. So there are many ways to look at that. So often these views, in many Indigenous cultures, view health in that kind of sense. And I do feel that modern medicine is going to integrate that way. But many patients, they do come from that viewpoint where we have to take the time to hear their stories. And when it comes down to traditional medicine, I've had some colleagues say to me, this is not evidence-based medicine, Rachel. So it doesn't really, you shouldn't like, but it's like, how can it be evidence-based medicine if we neglect these communities and don't involve them or aim to involve them? It's like, how do we kind of look at a modern way of integrating traditional Indigenous research methodologies and traditional medicine and evidence-based medicine, right? To make this move forward. So I trained in the quote unquote Western medical evidence-based system. So I didn't study traditional medicine. So I don't know these things, but I can tell you that from a cultural safety and culturally competent approach, patients will be using them, right? And if they're scared of telling you that, they're not going to disclose. So I have had patients, for example, who like to use bear grease and bloodroot for their atopic dermatitis. Or it doesn't have to be a herb from a tree. Traditional medicine also can count seeing an elder and taking the time to talk about the holistic stressors that they're dealing with and healing from a holistic perspective. So I think that all of these things, there's a lot of groundwork to be made, and I don't think it's, and again, I'm very kind of bound in a way, being an evidence-based Western medicine, quote unquote, person. I can't give any suggestions to my patients, but to listen to them and to approach from a culturally competent way, I think that there's somehow we need to open those discussions, because patients are going to do these things. They're going to use these things. And by kind of just ignoring it is not going to make it go away, and is going to, I think, even build more distrust. So that's where I think we need to integrate both Indigenous research methodologies and the traditional evidence-based medicine system. Huge need in dermatology, in fact, almost unheard of in our specialty. So
Yeah, I have briefly, very in a kind of a small way, experienced that when trying to work together with our team to put together the Indigenous health component of the website and realizing there's almost nothing to go off of.
that's the
And
problem.
and
Yeah.
so our page ended up being one of our students, Taylor Miller, was really spearheading this. She put together this resource based off of a lot of Indigenous skincare companies. So they have looked into some of the pharmacological properties of things like white sage and the traditional medicines and herbs, and created a resource that kind of shares what some of those medicinal properties can be and how they can apply to skin. But it's very much, it's not the traditional evidence-based kind of resource, because it was no research to go off of. So it was a very different
Yes.
approach. Yeah.
And the other thing too is a sustainability, right? Like we don't want to identify a herb and then go, take every herb from Canada and land and make it into a cream, right? We have to find a sustainable way to do this if we're going to explore that. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So early days, and I'll be honest with you, I'm in my late 30s now, and I'm still considered quote unquote to a certain extent early career. And honestly, this is something I hope to learn more about and integrate myself more in the next decade of my practice. So maybe there's another podcast in several years, I'll have more information to share. But right now, the only information I have is what my patients tell me, and that I support them in the way that I can and let them tell their stories. And it's all a risk benefit at the end of the day, right?
Kind of pivoting slightly, something else that you mentioned is that you work with a lot of students, both in the past and currently you're involved in medical students and their training.
Yes. Ezra knows that. Anyways, Ezra's listening in here. Okay, yeah, go ahead.
We were wondering if you had any advice for medical students, maybe who are currently on their dermatology rotations, about how they can conduct themselves in the clinic, maybe make them stand out, or even advice for how to, if our listeners are interacting with Indigenous patients, what they can do to make them comfortable or have that really good patient provider relationship.
Yeah. So I think that there could be some kind of general thoughts on that. One is, to kind of try your best to get a broad exposure to dermatology and keep up to date. There's a lot of modern conversations happening in our younger generations that are very exciting and are kind of new areas of frontiers, things like the skin of color disparities or Indigenous health disparities. So one is to keep up to date with that. And by doing things like this podcast is a wonderful approach. I work with a lot of students, both in and out of province, and I've been exposed to many different programs and residents. And for me, I find everybody has their own strengths in their learning. But for me, what I tend to like to see is someone who takes initiative in the clinic in terms of, proactively, going in to see the patient if the staff is okay with it, and, trying to, take an effort to look at the person's skin, describe it, try to describe an approach. Use your morphology, right? You have to learn all of these things. And as a dermatologist, I remember being a student, I was so overwhelmed with writing derm histories. It's like, oh, these people are talking about all of these spots and all these irritations. Like, where do I start? And I think that in a way, it's a progression. So don't lose hope in the sense that it can be overwhelming at the beginning, because dermatology is a specialty that we're not as exposed to. So that's a normal feeling, and just continue to try to work and get yourself ahead in that sense. The other thing too is to, again, be aware that dermatology is not just all urban based, and there are many facets to dermatology that are needed in Canada, in particular medical dermatology. So one is to expose yourself to peripheral areas that overlap with skin health, things such as, rheumatology, infectious disease, pediatrics, all of these things you can have skin exposure to kind of get a bigger picture. When it comes down to Indigenous patients, and I don't like to summarize or lump everybody into one approach. But generally, given the kind of the trauma that some patients have faced, or the mistrust with the system, or just never seeing an Indigenous physician, you have to give them time to tell their stories, and listen to them. And I feel like cultural competency is something that there's a really good module under CMPA that I would recommend students to look at. They provide some excellent guidance in terms of ways we can kind of go about that. And it's not just for Indigenous patients. Canada is a very multicultural country, and we have a lot of people from different areas of the world here. So I think that that's a very important area to be aware of as well. So.
Thank you for the advice. I think those were really tangible things, and I really appreciate hearing them as kind of a reminder before I start my own rotations.
Yeah, and I have much more to say, but I don't want to get it. It'll be too much for you guys. I could talk about dermatology and medical students forever, but
I mean, that's why we're here.
yeah, wonderful.
So before we kind of get to some of the fun questions that we like to end our podcast off, I wanted to create a space and see whether there was anything else that you wanted to share, maybe something that you think all students should know before pursuing dermatology, or maybe a last piece of advice for our learners who are listening and are interested in dermatology.
Yes. One thing I think we need to do as a group, whether we're students, residents, or staff, is we need to encourage better education in skin diagnostics and management for all populations in Canada. And as someone who's been involved with many curriculum developments across the country, I've heard over and over again from my colleagues in different provinces that we don't get enough skin dermatology training in medical school, residency, nursing school. They get a lot of horizontal and vertical overlap with other common diseases or organ systems. And I always use diabetes as an example. But these are common problems. And in my experience, one of my biggest issues with dermatology is getting referrals where it's like, it's almost like I would compare a common case like a hypertension versus like a common eczema. It's like we don't have the approaches and the knowledge. I think that falls back often into curriculum where we might only get a week of dermatology, right? Or two. Whereas how much training do you get in others? So I think that there needs to be an assessment of the undergraduate curriculum and maybe even postgraduate curriculums in terms of, and this could be done at a national or a local or regional level. But for example, our family medicine unit here, we have some family medicine residents. They don't want to be dermatologists, but they have pinpointed and expressed to me that they need more skin education training, and that how can we improve this in our curriculum, or how can we improve this in the medical school curriculum, because there's so many skin diseases, there's so many long waiting lists. So I think that we need to readdress the skin curriculum and look at what's being taught. Is this enough, and how can we improve it? Because at the end of the day, there's just waiting lists are super long. So I think I really wanted to get that across. Yeah.
I stand by that so hard.
Yeah.
Kind
Exactly.
of in a 3-year program myself, I definitely feel like already things are so condensed that condensing dermatology even more to where we only had a 1-hour talk or so. I think that's where skin curriculum, like our initiative was born out of, because it was like, oh no, like I don't know where to go, because
Yes.
you kind of expected to get all this knowledge within medical school, and then realizing that
Yes.
the curriculum isn't equal across all specialties, across all
Yes.
disciplines. And unfortunately, dermatology is one of those where we don't really get as much learning as a lot of people.
Yes. And as someone who's seen thousands and thousands and thousands of patients, I see this pattern, and they wait a long time. The other thing I did want to mention is the role of research and my story. So I discovered research later in my career, not until I graduated residency. I did my typical projects in residency, no, but I didn't have a particular drive towards it. I was just doing a lot of other clinical learning and all these things. But actually, I learned about research later, just like I bloomed into dermatology later. It's like my career just, I never pictured it this way. But one thing I think I've discovered the role for research is the whole purpose of research is to contribute to a new knowledge base where things are lacking, right? And the example that I use is Indigenous skin health, where I noticed a lot of problems like infected eczema and uncontrolled skin disease in the communities around here. And I tried to meet with various people to talk about it, but I realized I had no evidence base to show them, or very minimal. So I could talk about my experience all day and these potential crises I'm seeing with diabetic ulcers and severe eczemas that are chronically impetiginized and things just really out of control. And I realized after kind of trying to raise some conversation to make change that it needs to be better documented in order to have more tangible actions. So one of my interests in research, which came later into my career, and I actually went back to school after residency to do my master's degree, was to be able to kind of use that to help develop a new knowledge base and have more information to integrate that. So I think that's another important point to get across.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And I love that you kind of went back to kind of incorporate more of that research, or you mentioned how it was a little bit maybe later on. I think it's a good message that there's always a right time for the people listening and our learners to get involved and work on research and incorporate it into their future careers.
Absolutely. And a good mentor is always good too. If you find a good mentor, like I had Dr. Hull, Dr. Scott Walsh, and Dr. Shear in Toronto were very fundamental mentors for me. I still have mentors, right? And I'm a staff now, but we never stop learning. And I think that's also important in our specialty.
Definitely. Okay, so before we end off our episode, we like to ask all of our guests some rapid fire questions.
Oh gosh. Okay, I'll try my best.
Yeah, they're just to let our listeners get to know you a little bit outside of medicine. And we start off with our first classic question on every episode so far, and that is, do you have a favorite skincare product?
Yes. So are you talking, well, I'll be honest, I like retinoids, topical retinoids. I know that it's Some are over the counter, some are prescription, but we call retinoids jack of all trades, topical. I pretty much don't know any dermatologist who, you know, doesn't use a topical retinoid. As someone who's prone to acne, you know, and people use retinoids for many different reasons, but I personally prefer my retinoid. But yeah, I'm not really too fancy with my skin regimens. I do have a little bit of sensitive skin. I'll be honest, I recently discovered SkinCeuticals through my excellent colleague, and I've like fallen in love with their Phyto Gel and CE Ferulic, and now I'm like, I used to be not fancy with my skin regimen. I'm like, I gotta have these. They make my skin feel so good. So yeah, I would say those would be mine. And don't forget your sunscreen.
The classic answer.
Yeah.
SkinCeuticals is also a go-to dermatologist answer, but they are so expensive.
Yeah, no,
But I
it's true.
know they have the research, so I know that's why they're the star. Okay.
Absolutely.
So I could be completely off base with this question, but I thought I'd give it a go. I saw when you joined that there was a kitten on your Zoom screen. So
Yes.
my question is, do you have any animals? And
Yes.
what kind? What are their
Thank
names?
you. So this gives me an opportunity to talk about my special girl. Her name was Uno, and I got her my first month of residency. And I
Oh,
remember growing up, and my parents would say, "Oh, cats, you know, I never had a cat. The cats, they just hang around in basements. They're not personable." And I moved to Toronto, and my first month of residency, I went to the Humane Society, and there were all these cats, and there was this little one-eyed cat, and she had nerve damage. She looked kind of a little weird. But she had a lot of medical problems. And so I just fell in love with her. And when she came up to the cage, she went, yeah, and she put her little paw out. And the next thing you know, I was bringing her home on the subway in a cardboard box.
aw.
And her and I really developed a special relationship. And she was with me for 12 and a half years. She studied with me. Her name was Uno. All the residents knew her. All the staff knew her. I thanked her at my graduation. She unfortunately passed away on October 27th, 2021 from a cardiomyopathy, and it was hard for me. Like I had to like move out of my apartment. I couldn't handle being alone without her. But she is probably the best thing that's happened to me in my life, and I still think about her every day. I don't have her anymore, but I love cats, and I have a barn cat rescue named Jinx. He's about a year and a half, and he's kind of the opposite of Uno. Like he runs around, he's not overweight and missing an eye, he's jumping up trees, but he's also really sweet and growing on me, and my family loves him. So I would have to say I'm a cat lady for life. Yeah.
Oh, thank you for
They
sharing.
also have strollers. They have their own strollers, and like Uno
Oh
had
no, really?
a rack of clothes. Yeah, she was spoiled rotten, that cat, I'll tell you. You have no idea.
It's funny because until you have an animal, you think, it's so weird to dress your animal in clothes, and then you get an animal and now they have Halloween costumes and everything. So
She had like a whole rack of costumes, and it was like I'm
see,
talking a big
see,
rack.
and it's
I
not
don't have kids, so she was my kid.
sounds good. Emma, your turn. Last question.
Yes. So for our final question, we were wondering if you had like a particular food that's your favorite, maybe something that's more local to the west side of Canada, or just any food in general.
I'm kind of embarrassed to answer this. I I'm really bad for getting takeout, and I will just be totally honest. My absolute favorite is McDonald's Big Mac with extra pickles and the fries with ketchup, and that is my go-to. Um, I also like Pizza Hut, but I'd have to say McDonald's. I'm not really like, I can't really think of anything else at this time.
That's okay.
I got to get better with the fast food, but I love McDonald's.
There's something about the fries that just are unmatched in any other restaurant. So I
I
think
agree.
a universal known thing.
Yeah, and I worked at McDonald's for about 5 years actually before I started medical school, and I loved it. Like I still think about going back there to work, and I was like the drive-through girl. I worked at all the stations, but yeah, I
So
miss those days
interesting.
sometimes. Yeah.
They probably wonder, why does this dermatologist keep hanging around? But little do they know you're just the alumni.
Yeah, McDonald's to dermatology. No kidding. Yeah.
Well, that was a wonderful answer. Perfect to end off on. And on that note, I wanted to say a huge thank you to you so much We learned so much this episode. It was one of the best talks we've had. We really appreciate you being here, Dr. Asiniwasis.
Thank you.
Truthfully, thank you so much.
The students are always allowed to call me Rachel.
Well,
some people can call me Rachel, some people can't. They have to call me doctor, but you guys can call me Rachel.
It's a little hard, but okay.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for joining us today.
Thank you.
And to all our listeners, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. I just want to say thanks for having me today. And I think it's awesome what you guys are doing. And yeah, I look forward to maybe even tuning into your other podcasts as well.
That's so wonderful to hear. And you know what? We haven't started our electives yet, so maybe we'll see you in Regina.
Absolutely. Well, we are getting requests from out of province, and if we have room, we take them. And then we do have students come with us to the communities as well and do virtual care and see everybody in Regina.
Yeah. That's a wonderful plug. Oh, and by the way, to everyone listening right now, to follow Origins Dermatology, they are also on Instagram.
Please. Yes.
And
we're new with our social media, but we're going to be more involved soon. Yeah.
Perfect. And so thank you everyone for listening. We hope to have you back here for our next episode. If you want to keep up with our podcast, offer any feedback, or want to know when we post next, you can follow us on Instagram and Twitter at Skin Curriculum, or visit our website at www.skincurriculum.com. Otherwise, we hope you enjoyed this episode of Dose of Derm, and we hope you all take care.